Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, January 26th, and what a week it's been. Let's start with Germany. Last week, news broke out about a secret meeting of right-wing leaders near Potsdam, where the group discussed the deportation of all foreigners from Germany. Sound familiar? Well, so it did to hundreds of thousands of German citizens who marched in the streets over the weekend to stand up for democracy. What can we expect next in this brewing debate? Then, with Trump's victory in New Hampshire, the fate of a much-discussed border deal that would also include much-needed aid for Ukraine appears to have been sealed. Senate Republicans appear ready to join their House counterparts in opposing any agreement to address the issues at the southern border, at least any agreement that President Biden could claim as victory. Meanwhile, the fate of Ukraine hangs in the balance. And then finally, North Korea. If active wars in Europe and the Middle East aren't enough, North Korea is now threatening war in Asia. Earlier this week, the dear leader, Kim Jong-un, said the North was now no longer interested in peaceful unification, only to force the subjugation and annexation of the South. And he was rattling all kinds of weapons to make his point. So here to talk about all of these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Carla Robbins, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and formerly with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Stefan Kornelius, political editor at the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and Peter Spiegel, U.S. editor of the Financial Times. Good morning, all. Wonderful to see you. What a week, as I said, that we just had. So let's talk with Stefan about Germany. Really remarkable public outpouring over the weekend over a story in a freelance kind of reported journal, but really has mobilized the society in a way we haven't seen in quite a long time. Tell us what exactly happened and where is this going?
Right, Ivo, and it hasn't actually ended yet. The biggest demonstration will still to come next week in Berlin. Most likely, probably a million people out there on the street. And the sum of those, having been out for the past days, tops well over the million already. And it's not only big cities, it's small cities. It's also rural Germany, especially in the east, where the right-wing party, AfD, is very strong. So it's an outpour of anger, of sort of democratic values, which we now see on the streets. Important. Now, what happened? We basically watched sort of a combination of problems in Germany, both politically and sort of on the democratic level. Politically, a lot of unsolved issues. Government which is not performing, a lot of anger with spending issues, farmer protests. So there is a kind of tension in society. Then came this research by journalists, freelance journalists, who came up with news that aides, mostly aides, not operatives of the AfD, were assembling at a villa in Potsdam, and that resonated to very deep historic stories. And you all remember the Wannsee Conference, where the Nazis decided on extinguishing the Jews in Germany. And that was in the Hitler era. And now we are back. Those people assembling again, talking about deportation, talking about remigration, as they frame it, and not only of those people who come into the country now seeking asylum, but also those who are here with German roots and everything, even German citizenship. Nevertheless, this is praying for. This is something hypothetical. Nevertheless, it triggered a huge outcry, a huge storm of protest, and a show of sympathy for our democratic values, and actually pressure to go against this party, the AfD, which is up there to be decided whether it should be banned or not. Now, German party banning is quite a huge task in all our countries, and German constitution especially. You have to fulfill a lot of prerequisites before you go that step. It will not happen that fast, but nevertheless, it shows that people are extremely sensitive to the threat of the far right. And the far right is out there, it's strong, but then again, don't overplay the hand right yet, because we're in the middle of the term. Usually, polls are showing some extreme figures at that point of the political season. When elections come closer and people really have to decide who they vote for, they go back and question themselves whether they should set a protest vote or should really go back to those hands who they deem to be reliable. The AfD came up with 12% after the last general elections. Now they're already somewhere at 20%. That would be a huge step. I don't expect them to end up there. They will fall back, but they grow slightly in the East. And this is the important part where we do have two major regional elections this year. They rate extremely high. They are actually not the number one party. And the big danger is that they might even be in a position where they take over a premiership on a regional level in Thuringia. And that might really cause be cause for concern. And this is why now public outcry is so strong. We also have European elections this year where all over Europe, the right-wing parties appear to be very strong. So, yes, Germans are voicing their deep concern. They're showing, no, we are the majority. We don't let you take over the political thinking and the political debate. This is us who do this. But in the end, we have to really find the right balance in what can be done politically, how they can be fought politically, how the established parties can regain terrain against the right-wing AfD, and how much of all of this is German angst and German psychology. And don't underestimate that. We know from history there is a big aspect to that in German political life. It was Karl Popper, the philosopher, who warned about this pair of cultural pessimism, which was his major book on how Germany flipped into the Nazism, and just recently other thinkers and writers who voiced the same concerns. So the message is, yes, be aware, be out there in the streets, but come up with a political solution. Probably some good governing would be a start.
Stefan, can I ask you, you said very clearly that let's not over-egg this. Let's not think we're going down a rabbit hole here. But I guess you raise two issues which I think are worth pushing back on, because you mentioned that they did win those two regional elections, or did very well in the two regional elections. So your argument that as election day gets closer, they tend to lose support or sort of belied by that result. The other point I'll just make is Geert Wilders in the Netherlands. And obviously the Netherlands is not Germany, but again, the same dynamic was the case for his party in the Netherlands, which is he always polled higher going into the last week of the election and then always dropped by 10, 15% on election day. And that didn't happen either. I guess I'm wondering why you're so optimistic, or maybe optimistic is the right word, but like why you believe that we're maybe at risk of over-egging it as opposed to underselling the threat.
They have two perfect points, because the two länder I'm talking about in the East, that's Thuringia and Saxony, are very special. And those länder are running extremely high with the AfD. And for some reasons, or for many reasons, the AfD, the right-wing parties, have taken a big foot in the southeast German part of the country. That happened after unification, and that happened because the traditional parties, mostly the Conservative and the Social Democrats, were not able to build a base there, and they haven't really taken roots in the East. That's taken over now by the AfD, which has brought in whoever they got. I mean, that's the baker, that's the guy who runs the fire station, that's the guy who runs the nursery and doctor's office. They're all now in this party. It's a party of the establishment in the East. But that's only those 2 or 3 länder, and that's not all of Germany. It's a big disparity between those 3 and the rest. But the Dutch example is very striking, because that's basically what we talk about now here. Are we getting into a Dutch situation? Is Germany becoming a Dutch party model, where we have a huge array of parties and basically the inability to form coalitions? The last time, and Evie, you might know better than I do, it took 140-something days to find a governing majority in the Netherlands, and they're still looking out now for a majority to vote for after the elections. And that's the same here. The German system forces you to form alliances, to form coalitions. But those parties who are able to come together and find common ground are getting rarer and rarer. And that's the problem here. This weekend, we have the formation of 2 new parties on the right-wing populist side in Germany. More some party coming from the left, but sort of turning extreme right, which is not unusual. Sarah Wagenknecht, she's building up her own force, might instantly jump into parliament. And another one who's a kind of a splinter party from the CDU, the Conservative Party. And those guys, they're all sort of they're testing the fear of those people out there. They're trying to get some crumbs from that cake. They might be actually quite successful. So we do see our diversification of the party system with the negative effect that in the center, which actually holds the country, it's harder and harder to find majorities.
Yeah, Stefan. I mean, you don't want to start becoming like the Dutch political system, or the Belgian one for that matter, which is probably even worse when it comes to fragmentation. I mean, the good news in the Netherlands is the government can't be formed because there's no one who wants to govern with Wilders, and you still need 50% of the seats in Parliament to win. But it also means that governance itself is called into question. Carla, I think this is it was striking to see that you have that many people, and I think partly because of angst and German history and everything else, but also just because of the respect for democratic values, coming out to support that. Frankly, against a side of kind of arguments that we hear every day in the United States in one form or another. In fact, in the next topic, we'll talk about the border deal and the negotiations on that. The idea of migrations being sent out of the country is part of our political debate. It's a political debate. It's not U.S. policy, but it's part of the political debate. How should we look at what's happening in Germany, and what can we learn about that, not only in the United States, but frankly in other countries where migration is the biggest issue for most Western and democratic political systems?
Well, migration, of course, has become the explanation for the rise of some really nasty populist movements that we're going to see. And this is the year of the election, and it's pretty scary. And I'm not saying that, that their currents within the Republican Party are like the AfD, but boy, that language that we're talking about here, including the great replacement theory, is a pretty strong strain there. If you listen to the way that former President Trump is campaigning right now, his song about the snake, that comes into your house is talking about the pollution of the bloodstream, about the things that Stephen Miller's group are talking about deporting people, the notion of questioning about whether people are born in the United States really are American citizens. And there's some pretty fundamental things that are going on in the United States that sounds an awful lot like what was going on at that meeting. And why Americans are not out in the street doing it. There was that time when President Trump was in and the Muslim ban took place. If you remember all those people who rushed out to JFK and said, come on in, this is not who we are. I think that Americans the majority of Americans do believe that we're a nation of immigrants, but I don't think people are activated yet. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, Trump campaigned on a border crisis that didn't exist at the time when he campaigned first time around. Right now, there are a lot of people coming into the United States, and even people who are horrified by Trump's rhetoric feel like the border is not adequately under control. So Biden's going to have to campaign on this with a rational policy, but nobody I know wants, even sort of sane Republicans don't want this sort of snake coming into your house rhetoric. So we'll see whether people respond.
Carla, I think your second point is really worth emphasizing because it is, I think...
The first one not worth emphasizing.
Nah, that wasn't so good. The other one was much better. No, my point is it's gone from an issue that, let me say it a different way. Painting anyone who supports a tougher immigration stance as a right-wing zealot, I think, is a mistake. What I've seen in our reporters in Iowa, in New Hampshire, and elsewhere is that this issue has moved to the political center. And it's not just in the U.S. The U.K. is going through the same thing right now. They have elections coming up, who knows when, probably the second half of the year. But again, it is mainstream conservative Tories, and even within the Labour Party that are struggling with the immigration issue because, as you said, Carla, there is a marked, almost an orders of magnitude increase in the numbers who are showing up on the borders because of climate change, because of regional strife and stuff like that. And I think that what there has to be, and Stefan touched on this in his "What's the solution?" There has to be a policy response. There has to be a policy response. I think the British solution is this bizarro, let's ship them to Rwanda. And it's sort of out in left field. The problem in the U.S. is, which I'll get to in the next segment, is the Congress is so deadlocked over anything that they can't get a positive policy response. But I think it is worth the radical center, for lack of a better word, to think about this issue and try to come up with solutions, because this has become an issue that is, as I would argue, is not just the right-wing neo-Nazi right anymore. It has become a much more mainstream concern, whether it's justified or not, and just labeling people who are worried about this as right-wing zealots is not a political winner.
That's certainly.
Let me ask you a question. Will there be ever an adequate solution to this? Will there ever be an adequate answer? Because you can never ever fend off everyone, and this is going to be sort of a central issue we face with. And what I do see here in Europe with the British, with the French, with all.
Just to get back to Germany, the one I remember so distinctly was Angela Merkel flying to Ankara to sit in a throne next to Erdogan ahead of his election, because the EU had decided to pay 2 billion euros to encamp everyone in Turkey. The imagery of this stuff is just horrible, right? You pay an authoritarian leader in Turkey $2 billion to basically set up camps for immigrants in Turkey, and then go and sit on him and endorse him for re-election. The solutions are just all very ugly. They're doing the same thing. The Europeans are doing the same thing in Libya, where they are partnering with really, really horrible, basically warlords in Libya to prevent the flow of immigrants coming up through the Mediterranean. So you're right, Stefan. I think the problem is there a policy solution? I don't think there is, but it's the number of mainstream people who I used to respect on this issue were saying, maybe it wasn't such a bad idea to build the wall. It's just slightly frightening to hear how mainstream some of those ideas have become.
But you can't normalize, the need for dealing with a solution that rationalizes the border, that looks at how tough should our asylum standards can be. Let us not forget the number of children who were separated from their parents who still haven't been returned to their parents. Let us not normalize the sort of language that we start talking about the pollution of the American bloodstream. This is language that sounds frighteningly like the language that was in Germany. I think saying that there's a problem at the border is a legitimate thing. Saying that the Democrats blew it by not dealing with the policy is absolutely legitimate. But the normalization of the language that we're hearing from President Trump is absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, I would sort of put two other pieces on the table, which is it is not a coincidence that there are 300,000 people trying to come into the United States in December, or indeed hundreds of thousands of people trying to get into Europe. They actually want to come here because of what we represent and the opportunity that we have, number one. Number two, without immigration in large numbers, both in Europe and in the United States, our economic capacity to continue to produce at the level that we need will be undermined. And so the issue isn't whether you're in favor of immigration or not. The issue is, how do you manage that process in a way that is both humane and provide for some form of security and regularity. Opinion poll after opinion polls, including the one we do in the Chicago Council, shows large majorities of Americans want paths to citizenship, regularized immigration, and aren't part of this deportation stuff that you hear. But there's no policy, there's no strategy. There's a sense that anything goes, and that's, I think, what people are rebelling against. I think we're all in some ways saying the same thing, which may be a good transition, Peter, to there is this attempt forced by a decision by the Republicans sometime late in the fall to link the prospect of economic and military aid to Ukraine, to Israel, to Taiwan, to the Palestinians, with a deal on figuring out how to address the challenges at the southern border. And this week, it appeared that that deal might not happen. Always was going to be hard to get an agreement in the Senate, and even harder to get it through the House. But it looks like with Trump, frankly, sewing up the nomination. All but sewing up the nomination, is now dictating what is and isn't happening on Capitol Hill. So, Peter, explain what's happening and where do you think this is going?
Yeah, I mean, there's two elements of this. One is what's happening, and then there's the political ramifications for, which I think the former is easy to describe than the latter. Essentially, as you said, Ivo, and have written quite eloquently about, because Trump is now all but sort of the shouting, the nominee. The Republican Party is now, even those sort of anti-Trumpers in Congress and elsewhere, are waking up to the fact that they have to deal with him, and he does not want a border deal because he wants an issue. As a result, because as you said, all those aid packages, particularly the military aid to Ukraine, is tied to that. There is literally in the last 48 hours, a realization that this Ukraine aid may now be dead. Now, the first element of this was Mitch McConnell having a closed-door meeting with his Republican caucus in the Senate, in which he said, well, we can't really upset Trump. He's the nominee. We can't undermine him. And McConnell has been one of the most vocal pro-Ukrainian Republicans in the Senate. And if he's capitulating and giving up, then everyone saw the writing on the wall that this is happening. Now, he's tried to walk back those comments in the last 24 hours. No, that's not what he was saying. We're just declaring the political reality. But just literally before we came on air, we got in our email box a dear colleague from the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who said, even if the Republicans get a deal in the Senate, it's dead on arrival in the House. So the question now is, okay, if we're going to accept, as Ivo, you wrote, that this deal is now officially dead, what becomes of the politics? And I'd be interested to watch this. I'm still, maybe I'm being naive, Ivo, I'm a little bit less pessimistic than you are, because the one that came out today, and I hate to cite our biggest competitor here, but the Wall Street Journal editorial page, I never thought I would agree with the editorial page. The Wall Street Journal came out today and said, Republicans, you are missing a trick on this one for two reasons. One, do you really think you're going to get a better border deal than what we have on the table right now? And if you care about the issue, do the deal. The second thing is the politics of being the party that created a second Saigon, as they put it. Do you really want to be the authors of another Saigon in 1975 in Kiev in 2024? That is not a particularly good look going into November. Now, there are a lot of voters who have been convinced that this is throwing money down the toilet and that it's going to Ukrainian oligarchs and all this kind of stuff. But poll after poll after poll shows still to this day that most Americans think it's worth the funding to support Ukraine. The problem that the Republicans are running into is a subset within that American population that tends to be Republican has given up on Ukraine and has bought into this narrative that you heard Vivek Ramaswamy in his endorsement of Trump in New Hampshire. That again, this is throwing money down a rat hole. It's going to Ukrainian oligarchs. Why are we spending all this money? So for Republicans, if they were to vote for Ukraine aid by itself, they're voting against their own political interests. I mean, it's that crass. So they need the border deal to provide the political cover. And it did look like we were getting close. There's a team in the Senate that is negotiating on this, and the Biden administration was engaging on this for the reasons Carla pointed out, that there is a political reason for Biden to want a border deal, so he can say, hey, I'm doing the things that you're criticizing me for. But with New Hampshire, it does seem like a chip has flipped within the Republican Party, and they no longer want to engage seriously in the negotiations. The last thing I said that is a bit repeating. I'm not sure the politics going forward are as clear cut as we make them out to be. I think there's a wake up call going through Washington, particularly amongst national security Republicans, that, oh gosh, this is now not going to happen. Do we want to be the party that scuttled a border deal and lost Ukraine? It's like, who lost China in 1949, right? Do we want to be remembered as a party that did that? And I think there could be the adults in the room who come back and say, wait, we have to do this. I'm not, I don't think it's a good chance of that, but I think there still is a non-zero chance that the adults in the room, both in the Republican Party in particular, wake up to the fact that this is actually not a political winner for them, that it's actually a political loser both on the border and on Ukraine, and they change their minds. But boy, this could be the week that goes down as the week America lost Ukraine.
The week America lost Ukraine. Carla, how do you see it? Do you see, what chance do you give that there will be enough people? I mean, clearly, if there was an up and down vote today on Ukraine aid in the House and in the Senate, it would pass with flying colors, no doubt. Most of the Democrats would vote in favor, and in the Senate, well over half, and in the House, about half of the Republicans would vote in favor of it. But you're not going to get an up or down vote for all the reasons that Peter has said. But how do you see the dynamic? I think Peter lays it out beautifully in terms of the not wanting to lose Ukraine versus wanting the issue of the border playing out in the United States. And then, Stefan, I'm going to come to you on the Europeans who are dealing with a similar set of issues.
I don't know who the adults are in the room in the Republican Party anymore. I mean, that sounds flippant, but I really mean it. I mean, you got Mitt Romney, who's wagging his finger at them, but they don't listen to him. And the days of Condi Rice or Jim Baker having being the great sort of the voices of reason, nobody listens to them. And Baker voted for Trump anyway. And you can't rely on Lindsey Graham to do it. And he was, the person who was the internationalist. I don't know who the voices are that they listen to that would do this. I know that Tom Tillis is furious that they dropped the immigration deal. And that's one of the reasons why McConnell said, no, it's not dead. It's not dead, even after what he said in the closed door meeting on Wednesday. If the rules were different, if they didn't need to have, the rules both in the House and the Senate, the rules make it impossible to bring it to the floor. But if the rules were different, you would have it. But I don't know, Peter. I don't know who they are.
Well, I mean, let's just point out that there is a presidential candidate.
Lloyd Austin had a meeting on Tuesday, which is his monthly meeting with the representatives of the countries that give military support to Ukraine. And he said two things. One is they're running out of artillery shells. They're running out of ammunition. They're running out of everything they need to protect the cities, and don't depend on us to give it. It was that grim a meeting, and that was before Trump said what he said. So I'm feeling pretty grim right now.
I would just point out there is a presidential candidate who's still in the race who got 44% in New Hampshire, who is arguing for a deal for support Ukraine, and that's not a small percentage of the Republican Party. But I take your point,
Stefan, and that would be Nikki Haley, just to to put a name to a largely rapidly vanishing candidacy. But she's still there and she's still running. Who knows? That's how democracy works. Stefan, for you, Europe, one is having similar questions about aid, including big economic aid package that is up for discussion next week in Europe, and military aid packages. And I guess one, how do you see that evolving? And secondly, when Europe looks at this debate, and they see the United States, which has been the undisputed leader of the Western Alliance and, frankly, the undisputed leader of building the coalition to address Ukraine, and this debate, which has nothing to do with Ukraine, right? Nobody is arguing that Ukrainians don't really need this, other than the people who are against it no matter what. What does Europe say? What do they think?
Well, it's all about the undisputed leader of the Western world. It's just the case that this undisputed leader wants to have an election this year, and the entire world is waiting how this election goes. And with the election, the strategic fate of Ukraine will be decided. And everyone knows that November 5 is sort of the pivot day. That's the day where thumbs up or thumbs down. And the strategic aim of everyone in Europe was to keep us running until at least November 5, to have with the hope somewhere that there will be a majority in Washington supporting Ukraine standing up against Putin. And now if Congress decides to preempt this decision by not spending money and by weakening Ukraine militarily, that's sort of an early warning signal. It's not the final signal, because militarily, we're talking about status quo. It is highly important to keep Ukraine flooded with money for keeping the countries alive and for keeping the military in a state where it can fight back. But nobody expects this, given the military stance that we do have. Nobody expects that there will be decisive change in the frontline theater. It's all about getting to November 5. And Europe now is doing its own precautionary measures. And I'm sound that they do. There's a lot of talk on what to do preempting a Trump administration. There's a lot of benchmarking now being done on what we do give to the Ukrainians. Next week, there will be a European Council meeting. All heads of state and government are coming together, and they, for the first time, they agree to look eye to eye and open the books and tell what basically has been given to Ukraine, what's in the pipeline, what is coming this year, so things can be better organized. Germany has emerged as the main donor, followed by the British. Actually, after Brexit, after Britain leaving the EU, that's a highly positive signal on how the British do see the strategic importance of the alliance in Europe. Things are working together. Another dirty secret. I mean, there are talks ongoing on a pretty low level, but I mean not on a political level, but on high civil servant level, on nuclear deterrence. We are fearing that on November 5, given Trump would be elected, there might be no NATO anymore and no nuclear deterrence against Russia. And if that's the case, Europe is laying open. I mean, that's a huge vulnerability. And there needs to be a plan how to deter Russia in case of that happening. The British and the French do have nuclear deterrence. The Germans don't. So Germany is desperately, I mean, not trying to acquire nuclear weaponry, but there needs to be an idea. There needs to be a strategic plan on how to combine the European deterrence capability to fend off this ultimate thing. We have the biggest NATO maneuver now starting in history, and it's clearly aimed at deterring Russia. And there is no doubt, the British Supreme Commander this week was telling us about it. There's no doubt we should prepare for a war against Russia. Russia is out in the war footing. It's not over. It's not just a game by Putin. He wants to change the Western order. And part of that Western order is NATO and is the EU. So we're in it. But on the negative side, even all of the EU and Britain will not be able to muster the strength the biggest undisputed leader of the Western world is able to muster militarily and politically. So it's all about November 5.
It's all about November 5, which is if you are sitting in Ukraine, looking at the a 10-to-1 advantage of artillery shells coming at you as a 50-year-old soldier who's been called up and mobilized, and you have to wait till November 5th. It's not a pretty picture, and the same is true for the mother and her two children, who every night at 6 or 5 a.m. have to go into the bomb shelter because of the missiles that are coming in and the air defense capabilities that are no longer able to defend, whether it's Odessa or Kharkiv or Lviv pretty soon as well, let alone Kyiv. It's a pretty sad state of affairs, and one would hope that we can have soon a debate in the United States about those issues, as opposed to the question of who gains the momentary political advantage on one thing or another. It really is something. But the good news for us is we'll be back talking about these kinds of things in World Review next week. And before we do, just to really get people going, Carla, let me in the last segment of this conversation, let's talk about North Korea, where all of a sudden the intelligence community in the United States is waking up and say, you know what? We may have a war in the Korean Peninsula pretty soon. What's happening in that part of the world? Why are all of a sudden people focused on what's happening in North Korea?
Well, Kim, who is a man who loves his hissy fits, has had a pretty epic one. Since the 1980s, Pyongyang their official position is calling for an eventual peaceful reunification with South Korea. But at a Korean Workers' Party meeting last month, he announced that unification with South Korea was now impossible. And this is a guy who never does anything by halves. So he immediately ordered a rewriting of their constitution to define the South as its most hostile foreign adversary. And as you said in your intro, he said they could specify a goal of completely occupying, subjugating, and annexing the South. He also ordered reportedly the dismantlement of all state agencies responsible for reconciliation. Apparently, they scrubbed the web of any mention of reconciliation. And satellite photos show that there was this arch across this highway that went to the DMZ. It was that his father built. This was this 9-story arch of reunification, which has now been demolished. So if you didn't get the point, he's made it very clear. So, he always has these hissy fits, mainly when he's being ignored. And the Biden administration, which has said, we're willing to talk anytime, any place about anything, but they basically ignored. They've got a lot of other things going on. And let's face it, there's really nothing to talk to them about because they're not going to give up their nuclear weapons and we're not going to give them anything until they do. And probably, I think what he's looking for is what he's always looking for, which is we accept his nuclear weapons and we lift sanctions. But other people, there are some other analysts who think other things are going on here, that he's looking to curry even more favor with his new favorite bromance, which is Putin. He's sending artillery, he's sending all sorts of old stuff, but he's sending stuff to Russia. And the Russians are giving him pretty sophisticated technology for satellites and for missiles. So maybe that's what's going on. Is he going to really go to war? I'm a little more skeptical, but I'm not an intelligence expert on North Korea. If they were really going to go to war, would they really be giving away equipment? I think that's probably a pretty good question. But the possibility of miscalculation is always very real there. In the past, I remember in 2010, they shelled an island, they sank a South Korean military vessel. And the real possibility of miscalculation is serious because we have more than 28,000 U.S. troops there. And they have enough fissile material for 50 or 60 nuclear warheads. So I don't think he's planning on going more, but I also think he's pretty nuts. And I also think it's a really small space with a lot of potential for danger.
Peter, when you talk to folks in Washington, are they starting to pay attention to this? Did they think the prospect of war is real? Or is it, are they saying, no, it's a hissy fit? Well, that's just how he does it. How do they look at it? Are they starting to get worried?
So the line I have heard was from a senior U.S. official was, if it wasn't for Hamas and for Ukraine, we'd be all freaking out about North Korea. Now, as Carla said, there is divisions within the administration about how serious to take this, right? And the extent to which, particularly on the political end of the Biden administration, I think they tend to fall in the hissy fit basket. They think he's just doing that. He tends to do this around big American events, 4th of July, all this kind of stuff. New Hampshire primary, he did it right around this. This is a plea for attention. He wants to extract lack of sanctions, hard currency, whatever the things he's trying to extract. So they don't worry about it. The bit of the administration tends to be a bit more worried is the pointy end of the spear, as Carla said. The military does have, as Carla pointed out, not only U.S. troops stationed in outside of Seoul, but in Japan as well. The interesting thing I'll just throw into this is it's one of the, and I've talked about it in the show before, I think it's one of the most underreported diplomatic successes the Biden administration has had is in East Asia, where you have had traditionally what they used to call hub and spoke, right? None of the Asian allies of the U.S., particularly treaty allies, in which Japan and South Korea both are treaty allies along with Australia and New Zealand, none of them would actually deal with each other. They would all just deal with Washington, so hub and spoke. What Biden has been very successful at is changing that. And we don't have a security architecture like you do in Europe with NATO, clearly, but you do suddenly have the Koreans and the Japanese, who are longtime historic rivals, beginning to cooperate on intelligence sharing, cooperate on military exercises. The Australians have become huge allies of the Japanese on this point. The Philippines suddenly now welcoming the Japanese remilitarization. So suddenly you're seeing the sort of the U.S. allies in the region beginning to work together, mostly because of China, obviously. But what has been helpful in the conversations that have happened between the South Koreans and other allies is to be able to lay on the table the North Korean threat. The Japanese in general believe that the Chinese is much more of an existential threat, and they've been frustrated by the South Koreans because the South Koreans are focused always on the North. One of the beneficiaries of the benefits of the new cooperation between Seoul and Tokyo is the Japanese now see the South Korean view of the world much better, and the South Koreans see the Japanese view of the world much better. So I think regionally there is much more cooperation to deal with the North Korean threat. But I guess to go back to your original question, Ivo, I think the Washington view is overwhelmingly, I won't say overwhelmingly, at least the balance of the conversations I have had tend to be what Carla calls the hissy fit camp, which is we just think he's ginning up stuff to get attention, to get on the get a negotiation, to have some diplomat show up in Pyongyang and show some fealty. So I don't think there's a huge amount of concern that he's about to start a war, but there are enough people within the administration, particularly within the Pentagon and the intelligence community, who are raising alarm bells and think that, again, if we weren't so distracted by Ukraine and by Hamas, that there would be much more to do in terms of deterring him.
Well, listen, I mean, people, I'm not totally in the hissy fit camp. I mean, the point is that the potential for miscalculation is always there. I mean, they've sunk a South Korean, ship before. They've shelled islands. They're tossing off missiles into the water. And if they shoot things over Japan. And if something tumbles and it's, and the guidance system isn't right and they actually hit something, then you got the real potential for a conflict. And as Peter said, we have treaty obligations here. So even though we've got Gaza and even though we've got Ukraine, you can't ignore it.
Yeah, no, I mean, 2 points. I think you in a dangerous world in which people are willing to play with matches, something might get lit, right? And Kim Jong-un has shown that he loves playing with matches, and and particularly when nobody's paying attention to him. I also think he's very worried about this trilateral deal with the bringing the Japanese and the South Koreans together, and he's really, we see this as a good thing, but he's worried about it because it actually brings the Japanese in it. But Stefan, if a war happens on the Korean Peninsula, that won't leave Europe out either because there are European troops. We forget about that as part of the UN command. Not large numbers, but they're there as part of the armistice and the 1950-53 war in South Korea on the DMZ. Doesn't mean necessarily if there's a war in the Korean Peninsula that all of Europe will go to war, but their citizens and their troops are going to be affected.
They are there, but it's not an issue anyway. But nevertheless, I think the strategic community has taken note of the debate. There's little that can add to it. There is a long-time ambassador to North Korea who's now referred to all the time. He's a German, Thomas Schäfer. He came from East Germany. He's now a pretty reliable source, a very well established figure in the sort of in the game of figuring out Kim. And his reading is, it's again about November 5. This is Kim putting himself into a position to negotiate with Donald Trump on a much better footing. So he's upping the ante to raise the price. And this is what we see. But Carla is totally right. There might be a misstep and that might get out of control. I think, Peter, it's interesting you didn't, I mean, I fully agree with the Pacific picture you paint, but we haven't talked about China yet. And I wonder what China, how long China will actually look at this game happening in front of their front door. And I find it a bit pleasing or sort of helping that we now have for the third time high-level backdoor communication between the White House and the Chinese leadership. Jake Sullivan talking to Wang Yi now in Thailand, I think it was, for the third time in a very short period of time. And that China is also making noises on the Middle East, which we haven't talked about today, but the whole shipping business is affecting them as well. So yes, we do see China hopefully as being a more responsible actor and most hopefully in the neighborhood.
The interesting thing, though, is what Carla mentioned, which is there. The Chinese have always been slightly frustrated with the North Koreans, right? The Americans always leave the Chinese. Please, can you do something with the North Koreans? And the Chinese like, we're trying, that kind of thing. But the interesting point that Carla made now is there's another pal in town, right? The North Koreans now have another friend in Vladimir Putin, who clearly has no interest in making things quiet. And the question I have is, and I don't have an answer for this, but maybe I throw it to Carla. Do the Chinese still have as much leverage with North Korea as they did before if Kim has an outlet to Moscow now that he can rely on for foreign currency and aid and whatnot? The only other point I'll just make on the meeting in Thailand, which I think is actually happening maybe as we speak, or maybe it was yesterday, my time frame is a little bit off, is, as you said, the Chinese have much more at stake in the Red Sea than the Americans do, and this effort by the Americans to get the Chinese to lean on the Iranians, to lean on the Houthis, is an incredibly interesting dynamic that I think it's worth keeping an eye on. But it's slightly off topic. Carla, I was just curious what you think about whether Kim's new friend in Moscow in some ways dissipates the Chinese ability to actually impose their will on North Korea.
The Chinese are still the Korean source of oil. The food goes through there. They can turn off the spigot if they want to, and they have very different interests from what the Russians have. They don't want a crisis on the peninsula because the last thing they want to do is seek a collapse and see a whole bunch of North Koreans rushing into China. So stability has always been their goal. And if I had to bet, if anything, they're probably pretty peevish right now about that relationship.
Yeah, I think that's probably right, but it actually does create an interesting dynamic, almost Kissingerian when you think about it, because the reality is that I can't believe that the Chinese are happy with the kind of
exactly
relationship that is being established between Moscow and Pyongyang. In fact, in which the Russians are no longer relying on or listening to in the same way Beijing as they have up to this point, and at the same time finding that their leverage over Pyongyang may have been reduced, and so you now have this strange possibility that I think Peter and Stefan raised, that you have Jake Sullivan, the White House, and Wang Yi, the foreign minister, counselor, and also foreign minister, trying to figure out both how to squeeze the North Koreans and, frankly, how to squeeze the Russians as part of and the Iranians. And we may see that in 2024, the strangest thing of all, the one thing we were all most worried about, U.S.-China relations dominating the headlines, U.S.-China cooperating in the Middle East, on Europe, and in Asia. Wouldn't that be a nice way to start 2024? But we shall see how wonderful the diplomatic skills are of Team Biden and Team Xi.
That's a good point to drop it to end us on. It was such a depressing 45 minutes. I think a little point of optimism there at the end is exactly what we need. So.
Well, it's worth watching, because neither Biden nor Xi is at all interested in the next year to have this as a major issue. Absolutely. And in some ways, I think they have an interest in trying to solve these issues because they don't help any of them. Politically or economically. So with that, on that note of optimism, I want to thank Carla Robbins of the Council on Foreign Relations, Stefan Kornelius of the Süddeutsche Zeitung, Peter Spiegel of the Financial Times, and all of you for tuning in, listening, and watching. Great to have you all here. Wonderful discussion. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.